In rural Virginia's horse country, a successful architect was about to confront the family that abandoned her as a child. What started as a memorial reunion took a shocking turn when they treated her like an unwelcome stranger. Mia Blackwell wasn't your typical estranged relative. For 30 years, she had built her career from nothing, known for transforming broken structures into architectural victories. When her uncle Richard declared she didn't belong there, she had no idea she was walking into a generational reckoning. Mia's quiet decision to retrieve a legal document would shatter every assumption about inheritance and power. What began as painful rejection would become total upheaval when she revealed the property deed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The gravel crunched beneath Mia Blackwell's rental car tires as she navigated the winding drive toward her late grandmother's estate. She'd rehearsed this moment during the 3-hour drive from Richmond, the warm embraces, the tearful remembrances, the shared stories about Eleanor that would finally bridge the decades-long chasm in her family. But as the Victorian mansion came into view through the ancient oaks, something felt wrong. Cars filled the circular drive, not just visiting cars, but vehicles that looked settled, permanent. A Honda Civic with Virginia plates sat beside a pickup truck loaded with gardening supplies. Children's bicycles leaned against the wraparound porch. The sprawling estate, which should have been quiet and memorial-ready for a weekend reunion, buzzed with the kind of activity that spoke of daily life, not temporary gathering. Mia parked beside a minivan and sat for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The house looked better than she'd expected. Freshly painted shutters, manicured gardens, new stonework on the front steps. Someone had been caring for it. Someone had been living here. Through the passenger window, she watched her Uncle Richard directing 2 teenagers as they moved furniture from the porch into the house. He wore work clothes and moved with the authority of ownership, pointing and gesturing like a man completely at home. Her breath caught. Richard looked older than she remembered from the funeral photos her mother had shown her years ago. His hair silver now, but his commanding presence unchanged. A woman emerged from the front door. Jennifer, she realized, though her cousin had aged from the girl she vaguely remembered. Jennifer glanced toward Mia's car and froze, her face cycling through recognition, surprise, and something that looked like panic. Mia forced herself to move. She retrieved her single suitcase from the trunk, a pathetic contrast to the obvious permanence of her relatives' belongings scattered across the property. The weight of being an outsider settled on her shoulders like a familiar, unwelcome coat. "Excuse me," Jennifer called out as Mia approached the front steps. Her voice carried the strained politeness of someone addressing a lost tourist. "I think there might be some confusion." The words hit Mia like a physical blow. Confusion. As if she were the one who didn't belong here. "I'm Mia," she said, setting down her suitcase. "Mia Blackwell, David's daughter." Recognition flickered across Jennifer's face, followed quickly by discomfort. The teenagers stopped their work, staring openly at this stranger who claimed family connection. In the silence, Mia heard the sound of children playing in the backyard, their laughter floating through the air like evidence of lives being lived here. "Oh," Jennifer's diplomatic training kicked in, but her smile never reached her eyes. "We weren't expecting? Jennifer, who's that?" Richard's voice cut across the lawn. He approached with the measured stride of a property owner investigating a trespasser. When his eyes met Mia's, she saw no warmth, no recognition of shared blood or childhood connections. Only cold assessment. "This is Mia," Jennifer said quietly. "David's daughter." The name hung in the air like an accusation. Richard's expression hardened, and Mia felt the familiar sting of being reduced to her father's choices, his perceived betrayals. "I see." Richard's voice carried the weight of judgment passed long ago. "And you're here because?" The question was so blunt, so devoid of family courtesy, that Mia felt her professional composure waver. In her architectural practice, she commanded rooms full of contractors and clients. She'd presented designs to city councils and corporate boards. But standing here on her grandmother's porch, facing this wall of familial rejection, she felt 8 years old again, watching her father pack his suitcase while her mother cried in the kitchen. For the reunion, she managed, Grandmother Eleanor's memorial gathering. Richard's laugh was sharp and humorless. Memorial gathering. He repeated the words like they were foreign. There's no memorial gathering, young lady. This is our home. Has been for months. The casual dismissal in his voice, young lady, as if she were a solicitor or lost delivery person, sparked something fierce in Mia's chest. Around them, she sensed other family members emerging from various parts of the property. A woman with paint-stained hands appeared from behind the house. Aunt Patty, she guessed, though this person looked nothing like the rebellious girl from old photographs. 2 more adults emerged from the front door, and Mia caught glimpses of children peering through windows. They all watched her with the same expression, polite confusion mixed with territorial defensiveness. She was the intruder here, the outsider who'd shown up uninvited to their established life. I have an invitation, Mia said, though the words felt weak even as she spoke them. The formal card her grandmother had sent months before her death suddenly seemed inadequate against this wall of possession and belonging. From whom? Richard's question was a blade. From Eleanor. From grandmother. Grandmother. Richard's emphasis on the word was cutting. She was your grandmother for 8 years, Mia. She was ours for a lifetime. You don't get to show up here after 3 decades and claim equal standing. The cruelty of it stole her breath. 30 years of absence reduced to a choice, as if she'd been the one to sever ties, as if an 8-year-old girl had decided to abandon her family rather than the other way around. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. Dad, maybe we should. Should what? Richard turned his authority on his daughter. Welcome someone who's never once reached out? Who couldn't be bothered to visit while Eleanor was alive but shows up now that she's gone? Each word was designed to wound, and they found their mark. Mia felt the old shame rising, the child's certainty that somehow everything was her fault. That if she'd been better, different, more worthy, her father's family would have fought to keep her instead of cutting her away like a diseased branch. But beneath the shame, something else stirred. The professional competence she'd built through years of proving herself in boardrooms and construction sites. The knowledge that she'd built a successful life, despite their abandonment, not because of their guidance. You're right, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. I wasn't here. I was 8 years old when this family decided I wasn't worth keeping in touch with. I was a child when you chose to punish me for my father's decisions. Richard's face flushed. Your father chose his path. We didn't abandon anyone. You abandoned me. The words came out stronger than she'd intended, carrying 3 decades of buried pain. But I'm not 8 years old anymore, Uncle Richard. And I'm not going anywhere just because you find my presence inconvenient. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Mia could feel the family reassessing her, recognizing that the uncertain girl who'd stepped out of the rental car had been replaced by someone with backbone. Richard's expression shifted from dismissive to dangerous. This is private property, Mia, and you're not welcome here. I suggest you get back in your car and return to whatever life you've built without us. The finality in his voice was meant to close the conversation. Around them, the assembled family waited for her capitulation, her retreat to the margins where she belonged. Instead, Mia picked up her suitcase and took a step toward the front door. Actually, Uncle Richard, she said, her voice carrying a new quality, something that made Jennifer straighten and caused Patty to emerge fully from behind the house. I think we need to talk about exactly whose property this is. The words hung in the Virginia air like a promise and a threat. Mia could see the confusion in their faces, the first crack in their certainty about power and belonging, and who had the right to call this place home. For the first time since arriving, she wasn't the lost little girl seeking acceptance. She was Mia Blackwell, successful architect, Eleanor's granddaughter, and she had something that was going to change everything. The question was whether her family was ready to hear it. The weight of her family's collective stare followed Mia as she turned away from the front porch, her suitcase handle cutting into her palm. She could feel their eyes boring into her back. Richard's triumphant, Jennifer's conflicted, the others merely curious about this family drama playing out on their doorstep. Her rental car seemed impossibly far away. Each step a retreat that confirmed everything they believed about her. That she was weak, that she didn't belong, that she would fold under pressure just like they expected. Mia's hands trembled as she fumbled with the car door handle. The Virginia heat felt oppressive now, pressing down on her like the weight of 30 years of abandonment. Inside the safety of the rental car, she gripped the steering wheel and fought against the tears that threatened to spill over. The 8-year-old girl inside her whispered familiar refrains. "You're not good enough. You never were. That's why they left you behind." Through the windshield, she watched Richard gesture dismissively to the gathered family, probably explaining how he'd handled the unwelcome intrusion. Jennifer lingered on the porch steps, glancing toward the car with something that might have been concern, but even that felt like pity rather than genuine care. Mia closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe. In her mind, she heard her therapist's voice from years of sessions. "You are not responsible for other people's inability to love you properly." She thought of her corner office in San Francisco, the awards lining her walls, the respect she'd earned from colleagues who valued her vision and dedication. She'd built a life from nothing, had proven herself worthy in ways that mattered. But sitting here, reduced to the abandoned child they remembered, none of that seemed to matter. Her briefcase sat on the passenger seat, leather-worn smooth from years of client meetings and site visits. Inside, among the contracts and blueprints that defined her professional life, lay a manila envelope she'd carried across the country, like a talisman. She'd brought it as a memento, a tangible connection to the grandmother who had reached out in those final months when dementia began to claim Eleanor's sharp mind. The property deed. Mia's pulse quickened as she remembered the day it arrived, 6 months after Eleanor's funeral. She'd assumed it was some kind of mistake, a clerical error from the estate lawyer. Surely Richard, as the eldest son, would inherit the family property. Surely she was entitled to nothing more than memories of brief childhood visits and the faded photographs her mother had saved. But the document was clear, notarized, unambiguous. Eleanor Chen had left the entire estate, house, grounds, and all assets, to her estranged granddaughter, Mia Blackwell. She'd never intended to use it as a weapon. Now, watching Richard direct the family's activities with the confidence of ownership, Mia realized she'd been naive. This wasn't about a weekend reunion or honoring Eleanor's memory. This was about possession, about who belonged and who didn't, about the careful hierarchy Richard had constructed in her absence. Her phone buzzed, a text from her assistant about Monday's client presentation. The outside world, her real world, calling her back to sanity and success. She could drive away right now, return to her life, let them have their illusions of ownership and belonging. It would be easier, safer. But as she looked up at the house, her house, legally speaking, something shifted inside her chest. The shame began to transform into something sharper, more focused. She thought of Eleanor's final letter, the shaky handwriting that had accompanied the deed. "My dear Mia, I hope someday you'll understand that home isn't about who stays, but about who belongs." Mia retrieved the envelope from her briefcase, her fingers steady now. The deed felt substantial in her hands, official and undeniable. For 30 years, she'd been the outsider, the abandoned one, the family member who didn't count. But Eleanor had seen something different. Eleanor had made a choice. The walk back to the house felt different this time. Her steps were measured, purposeful. The family members scattered around the property noticed her return, some with surprise, others with irritation. Richard looked up from his conversation with one of the teenagers, his expression shifting from smug satisfaction to puzzled annoyance. "I thought we'd settled this," he called out as she approached. "We haven't settled anything," Mia replied, her voice carrying a new quality that made Jennifer straighten with attention. The front door stood open, revealing the familiar interior she remembered from childhood visits, the gleaming hardwood floors, the antique furniture, the family portraits lining the walls. But now she saw it through different eyes. Not as a place where she'd never belonged, but as an inheritance she'd never claimed. "Richard," she said, her voice carrying across the porch, "I think we need to have that conversation inside. All of us." Something in her tone made him pause. Around the property, family members began gravitating toward the porch. drawn by the shift in energy. Jennifer moved closer, her diplomatic instincts sensing a change in the power dynamic. From behind the house, Patty appeared, paint still staining her fingers, her artist's eye sharp with curiosity. "There's nothing to discuss," Richard said. But his authority sounded less certain than before. "Actually, there is." Mia climbed the front steps, no longer the uncertain woman who'd arrived an hour ago. "We need to discuss exactly who has the right to make decisions about this property." She could see the confusion in their faces, the first cracks in their certainty. Richard's confidence wavered as he tried to read this new version of his niece, the one who spoke with quiet authority instead of pleading for acceptance. The family gathered in the familiar dining room, around the mahogany table where Eleanor had hosted countless meals and important conversations. The afternoon light streamed through tall windows, illuminating the faces of people who shared her blood but had never shared her life. Mia placed the envelope on the polished wood surface with deliberate care. The simple manila folder looked innocuous among Eleanor's china and silver, but she could feel the weight of what it contained. Not just legal ownership, but 30 years of assumptions about to be shattered. "What is that?" Jennifer asked quietly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead of answering, Mia opened the envelope and withdrew the document. The official seal caught the light, and she heard someone's sharp intake of breath as they recognized the formal language of legal ownership. Richard reached for the papers with hands that weren't quite steady. The room fell silent as he read, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something approaching fear. Mia watched his expression crumble as the reality of Eleanor's final decision became undeniable. "This can't be right," he whispered. But it was right. Every signature, every notarization, every legal phrase that transferred ownership of the estate, from Eleanor Chen to Mia Blackwell, the family who had spent months settling into their inheritance, was about to learn that they'd been living in someone else's home. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, filled with the weight of everything that was about to change. The silence stretched until Richard's hands began to shake, the deed trembling like a leaf caught in wind. His eyes darted across the legal language again and again, as if repeated reading might change the words that named Mia Blackwell as sole inheritor of the estate he'd called home for 8 months. "This has to be forged," he said finally, his voice hollow. "Eleanor would never... She wouldn't have done this without telling us." But even as he spoke, Mia could see the doubt creeping into his certainty. Around the dining room table, the assembled family members leaned forward, trying to glimpse the document that had drained the color from Richard's face. "Let me see that," Jennifer said softly, extending her hand. Her diplomatic training was kicking in, the peacekeeper trying to manage a crisis before it exploded. Richard clutched the papers protectively. "It's fake. It has to be." Eleanor was, toward the end, she wasn't thinking clearly. Someone took advantage of her. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Mia felt the familiar sting of being cast as the manipulator, the outsider who would exploit a dying woman's confusion. But this time, the shame didn't come. Instead, she felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. "Are you suggesting I forged legal documents, Uncle Richard?" Her voice was steady, professional. "Or that I somehow coerced a woman I hadn't seen in 20 years into changing her will?" "I'm suggesting," Richard's voice rose, losing its careful control, "that my mother would never have betrayed her family like this. Not after everything we did for her. Not after I gave up my own plans to take care of this place." The raw pain in his words was unmistakable. Mia could see the man behind the authoritarian facade. Someone who had built his identity around sacrifice and duty, only to discover that his mother's final judgment fell elsewhere. "Dad." Jennifer's voice carried a warning. "Maybe we should call the estate attorney. Get this verified before we..." "Before we what?" Richard whirled on his daughter. "Before we accept that everything we've built here is meaningless? That the home we've made for your children is just borrowed space?" The mention of children seemed to hit Jennifer like a physical blow. Mia caught a glimpse of the deeper stakes. This wasn't just about property or family honor. Jennifer's teenagers had found stability here after her divorce. They'd built routines, friendships, a sense of belonging that she was desperate to protect. From the corner where he'd been quietly observing, Marcus stepped forward. Jennifer's son looked nothing like the rest of the family. Lighter hair, different bone structure, carrying himself with the careful distance of someone used to being on the periphery. "Actually," Marcus said, his teenage voice cracking slightly under the weight of adult attention, "I might know something about this." All eyes turned to him. Richard's expression shifted from desperation to hope. "What do you mean?" Marcus pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen with the fluency of his generation. "I've been working on the family genealogy for a school project. Grandmother Eleanor. She kept a lot more records than anyone realized." He turned the phone toward the table, showing what appeared to be scanned documents. She had correspondence going back years, including letters to someone in California. The room went dead silent. Mia felt her heart skip as she realized what Marcus had uncovered. Evidence of the secret relationship Eleanor had maintained with her mother, the connection that had led to those final months of reconciliation. "That's impossible," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" The question came from an unexpected source. Aunt Patty had slipped into the dining room so quietly that no one had noticed her arrival. Clay still stained her hands and apron, and she carried the scent of the Carriage House studio where she'd been working. Patty's eyes met Mia's across the table, and in that look, Mia saw something she hadn't expected. Recognition. Not the confusion or hostility of the others, but the steady gaze of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "Patricia," Richard's voice carried a warning. Don't what, Richard? Don't tell the truth? Don't admit that Mother had every right to make her own decisions about her property?" Patty's voice was calm, but Mia could hear steel beneath the surface. Jennifer looked between her aunt and father, sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. "What truth? What are you talking about?" Patty pulled out a chair and sat down with deliberate slowness, her artist's hands folding carefully on the table. "I knew about the deed," she said simply. "Eleanor showed it to me months before she died." The admission hit the room like a thunderclap. Richard's face went from pale to flushed in seconds. You knew, and you let us." "Let you what? Move in? Take over? Make assumptions about what belonged to you?" Patty's voice remained level, but her eyes were sharp. "Eleanor made her choice, Richard. She made it clearly and with full mental capacity, and she asked me to witness her signature." Mia felt the foundation of everything shifting beneath her feet. Her grandmother hadn't just left her the property in some final moment of dementia-addled confusion. This had been planned, deliberate, witnessed. "Why?" Jennifer's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why would she do this to us?" For the first time, Patty's composure cracked slightly. When she spoke, her voice carried decades of accumulated frustration. "Because you never asked what she wanted, any of you. You assumed that sacrifice meant entitlement, that being present meant being chosen." Richard slammed his hand on the table, making the china rattle. "I gave up everything for this family. I never married, never had my own life, because someone had to take care of Mother in this place." "No one asked you to do that," Patty replied quietly. "That was your choice, Richard, just like cutting David out of the family was your choice. Just like refusing to let Eleanor maintain contact with her granddaughter was your choice." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Mia felt something crack open inside her chest. Not the familiar pain of abandonment, but something closer to understanding. The separation hadn't just happened. It had been maintained, enforced, chosen again and again, by people who had convinced themselves they were protecting family honor. Marcus cleared his throat, still holding his phone. "There's more," he said quietly. "Grandmother Eleanor. She wrote letters. A lot of them. To Mia's mother. They're all here in the digital archive I found." He looked around the room at the faces of his family, his grandfather's crumbling authority, his mother's desperate confusion, his great-aunt's grim satisfaction, and this stranger who had walked into their lives with a piece of paper that changed everything. "Do you want to see them?" he asked. The question wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but everyone understood that the answer would determine what happened next. whether they would continue living in the comfortable fiction they'd constructed, or face the truth about Eleanor's final judgment on the family she'd left behind. Mia looked around the table at these people who shared her blood but had never shared her life. For 30 years, she'd wondered what she'd done wrong, what flaw in her 8-year-old self had made her unworthy of their love. Now she was beginning to understand that the failure hadn't been hers at all. Marcus tapped his phone screen with the careful deliberation of someone handling explosives. The soft glow illuminated his young face as he navigated through digital files that contained decades of family secrets. Around Eleanor's mahogany dining table, 6 people sat frozen in a tableau of anticipation and dread. "The earliest letter is from 1997, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years after Uncle David left. Richard's jaw tightened at the mention of his younger brother's name. Even now, nearly 30 years later, David's departure remained an open wound that had never properly healed. "Just read it," Jennifer said, though her voice carried the reluctance of someone asking to witness a car accident. Marcus cleared his throat and began reading from the screen, his teenage voice carrying Eleanor's careful penmanship across the years. "Dear Sarah, I hope this letter finds you and Mia well. I know Richard forbade me from contacting you after the divorce, but I cannot bear the silence any longer. Mia is my granddaughter, and I will not let family pride rob me of knowing her as she grows." The words hit the room like physical blows. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth. Patty nodded grimly, as if hearing confirmation of something she'd long suspected. Richard's face cycled through denial, anger, and something approaching panic. That can't be right," he stammered. "Mother agreed with us about David's choice. She understood that he'd betrayed the family." "Did she?" Patty's voice was soft but cutting. "Or did you tell her what she was supposed to understand?" Marcus continued reading, his voice growing stronger as he realized the importance of what he was revealing. "Richard believes he's protecting our family's honor, but I fear he's destroying our family's heart. Yesterday, Mia would have turned 11. I have missed 3 birthdays, 3 Christmases, 3 years of watching my granddaughter become the person she's meant to be. This cannot continue." Mia felt tears burning behind her eyes. All those childhood birthdays, when she'd wondered why her father's family never called, never sent cards, never acknowledged her existence, she'd assumed it was because she wasn't worth remembering. Instead, her grandmother had been fighting to reach her. "There are dozens of these letters," Marcus said, scrolling through his digital archive. "Look at this one from 2001. He read again. "Sarah, the photographs you sent of Mia's high school graduation brought me such joy and such sorrow. She looks so much like David at that age. That same determined expression, that same fire in her eyes. Richard intercepted my last 3 letters to you. I had to have Patty mail this one from town. I'm beginning to understand that if I want a relationship with my granddaughter, I'll have to choose between her and the son who's appointed himself gatekeeper of our family's love." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face had gone ashen, but his voice still carried defiance when he spoke. "I was protecting this family. David married outside our culture, abandoned our traditions. He chose his wife over his heritage. He chose love over prejudice," Patty said bluntly. "There's a difference." Jennifer's diplomatic instincts finally kicked in, though her voice shook. "What traditions, Dad? What heritage? We're second-generation Americans. Grandmother Eleanor worked her whole life to build something new here, not to preserve something old." "You don't understand." Richard's voice rose, with the desperation of someone watching his worldview crumble. "There are ways things are supposed to be done. Family obligations, respect for elders." "Respect?" Mia spoke for the first time since the letters had begun, her voice carrying a quiet fury that made everyone turn toward her. "You call cutting off an 8-year-old child respect? You call intercepting her grandmother's letters respect?" Marcus looked up from his phone, his young face grave with the weight of what he'd discovered. "There's more. Grandmother Eleanor kept copies of the letters she tried to send but couldn't. Letters about family events, about wanting to be part of Mia's life, about watching her career from afar. He scrolled to another entry and read, "I see in the architectural magazines that Mia has won another award. The Morrison Building in San Francisco. Her design made the cover of Modern Architecture Quarterly. I cut out the article and put it with all the others I've collected. Richard would be furious if he knew I was following her career, but I cannot help but be proud. She has her grandfather's eye for structure and her father's creative spirit. David would be so proud of the woman she's become." The words hit Mia like a revelation. Eleanor hadn't just been absent from her life. She'd been watching, caring, celebrating her successes from a distance. All those years when Mia had felt like an orphan in her own family, her grandmother had been fighting to bridge the gap that Richard had worked so hard to maintain. "I don't understand," Jennifer said, her voice breaking slightly. "If she cared so much about Mia, why didn't she do something sooner? Why wait until now to leave her the estate?" Patty answered, her voice heavy with years of witnessing family dysfunction. "Because she kept hoping Richard would change. She kept believing that love would eventually win over pride. She looked directly at her brother, her artist's gaze unflinching. She gave you 30 years to prove her wrong, Richard. 30 years to reach out to your brother's daughter, to be the uncle you should have been." "David chose to leave," Richard said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "David was 24 years old," Mia said quietly. "He fell in love with someone you didn't approve of, and instead of accepting his choice, you gave him an ultimatum: stay and abandon the woman he loved, or leave and lose his family forever." Marcus looked up from his phone again. "There's a letter about that, too. From right after Uncle David left. Grandmother Eleanor wrote, 'I watched my son choose between love and family today, and I realized that any family that makes such a choice necessary is already broken. Richard believes he's saving our traditions, but he's destroying our hearts.'" The weight of Eleanor's words settled over the room like dust. For 30 years, they had all lived with the consequences of choices made in pride and anger. Richard had built his identity around being the dutiful son, the family protector. Jennifer had accepted the narrative that her Uncle David was the selfish one who abandoned his responsibilities. Even Patty, despite her opposition, had lived within the boundaries Richard had established. Only Eleanor had seen the bigger picture, the cost of rigid expectations, the price of choosing honor over happiness. And in the end, she had made her final judgment not through words, but through the deed that now lay on the table between them. Mia looked around at these people who shared her DNA but had never shared her life. She could see the cracks forming in their certainty, the slow recognition that the family story they'd told themselves might have been wrong from the beginning. The question now was what they would do with that knowledge, and whether 30 years of separation could ever be bridged by truth alone. The morning sun cast long shadows across Eleanor's study as Marcus hunched over a cardboard box he'd retrieved from the estate's storage room. His teenage fingers moved carefully through yellowed documents and faded photographs, each piece a fragment of family history that had been deliberately buried. The previous evening's revelations about Eleanor's secret correspondence had sent him on a mission to uncover what other truths lay hidden in his great-grandmother's carefully organized papers. "Mom's going to kill me if she finds out I'm going through grandmother's private things," he muttered to himself, but his curiosity outweighed his caution. The family had spent the night in tense silence after the bombshell of Eleanor's letters, each person retreating to process what they'd learned about 3 decades of deliberate separation. His phone buzzed with a text from his younger sister, asking when they could go home to their real house, the apartment they'd left behind when their mother moved them to the estate after her divorce. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that his sister felt more displaced by their supposed inheritance than by the revelation that it might not be theirs at all. That's when he found it. The folder was unmarked, tucked beneath Eleanor's financial records, with the careful concealment of something meant to be hidden. Inside, Marcus discovered correspondence that made the previous day's revelations seem like gentle family disagreements. Letters, official-looking documents, and most damning of all, photocopies of letters that should have been delivered but never were. His hands trembled as he read through evidence of systematic interference, of a family member who had appointed himself gatekeeper of all communication flowing in and out of the estate. The scope of Richard's control was breathtaking and devastating. Marcus grabbed the folder and ran through the house, his sneakers squeaking against the polished hardwood floors. He found the adults gathered in the kitchen, the atmosphere thick, with unresolved tension from the night before. Richard sat hunched over coffee, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. Jennifer was making breakfast with the mechanical efficiency of someone trying to maintain normalcy. Patty leaned against the counter with her ever-present cup of tea, observing the family dynamic with her artist's eye. Mia sat slightly apart from the others, her architectural training evident in how she'd positioned herself to observe exits and entrances. She looked up as Marcus burst in, her expression shifting from polite distance to sharp attention as she saw the folder in his hands. "I found something," Marcus announced, his voice cracking with the weight of discovery. "In Grandmother Eleanor's papers. Something about the letters." Richard's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "Marcus, you shouldn't be going through letters that were supposed to be delivered but weren't," Marcus continued, his teenage sense of justice overriding adult authority. "Letters that were intercepted. Letters that someone made sure never reached their destination." The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle bubbling of Jennifer's coffee maker. Patty set down her teacup with deliberate care, her eyes fixed on her nephew with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting years for this moment. "Show us," Mia said quietly. Marcus spread the documents across Eleanor's granite kitchen island, his young hands steady, despite the enormity of what he was revealing. "These are copies of letters Grandmother Eleanor wrote to you and your mother," he said to Mia. "Letters that were returned to sender. Look at the postmarks. They were never delivered." Mia leaned forward, scanning the dates and addresses. Her breath caught as she recognized her childhood address in California, her mother's careful handwriting on envelopes that had been marked "Return to Sender" in a different, masculine script. "And these," Marcus continued, pulling out another set of documents, "are copies of letters your mother wrote to Grandmother Eleanor. Letters asking why Eleanor had stopped responding. Letters begging for contact. Letters that never made it past the mailbox." Jennifer moved closer, her diplomatic training warring with growing horror as she recognized the scope of the deception. "Marcus, are you saying that someone was intercepting mail? That's a federal crime." "Not someone?" Marcus said, his teenage voice carrying the moral clarity that adults often lost. He pulled out the final document, a letter from Eleanor to her attorney, dated just 2 months before her death. "Grandmother Eleanor wrote this to Mr. Patterson, the estate lawyer. She figured out what was happening." He read aloud in a voice that grew stronger with each word. "Dear Charles, I have discovered that my eldest son has been intercepting correspondence between myself and my granddaughter's family for nearly 20 years. Letters I believed were being delivered were never sent. Responses I thought were being ignored were never received. The estrangement I blamed on pride and stubbornness was deliberately maintained by someone who appointed himself guardian of our family's honor." Richard's face had gone completely white. His hands shook as he set down his coffee cup, the ceramic making a sharp sound against the granite. She couldn't have known. I was protecting the family. I was maintaining boundaries that needed to be maintained." "Protecting the family from what?" Mia's voice cut across the kitchen like a blade. "From love? From connection? From the possibility that your 8-year-old niece might actually want to know her grandmother?" "You don't understand," Richard said, but his voice lacked any conviction. "David's choices, they hurt Mother deeply. The cultural differences, the way he abandoned our traditions." "The only thing that hurt Eleanor deeply," Patty interrupted, her artist's voice carrying decades of suppressed truth, "was losing contact with her granddaughter. She told me, Richard. She told me how she would sit by the window waiting for letters that never came, how she wondered if Mia had forgotten her completely." Marcus wasn't finished. He pulled out copies of returned Christmas cards, birthday greetings, graduation congratulations, a paper trail of love that had been systematically blocked. "There are dozens of these. Years and years of attempted contact. And look at this." He held up a bank statement showing regular transfers to a California account. Grandmother Eleanor was sending money for Mia's college education. Money that was being returned because Uncle Richard told the bank that the account information was wrong. The revelation hit Mia like a physical blow. Her college years, working multiple jobs to pay tuition, living on ramen noodles and borrowed textbooks, believing her father's family had written her off completely. All while her grandmother was trying to help, trying to be present in the only way she could manage. Jennifer sank into a chair, her face pale with the recognition of what her father had done. "Dad, how could you? How could you interfere with people's lives like that?" "I was maintaining family stability," Richard said, but his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was preventing further pain, further division." "You were playing God," Mia said, her professional composure finally cracking to reveal the fury beneath. "You decided who deserved love, and who didn't. You decided which relationships were worthy of existence, and which should be destroyed." Marcus held up one final document, Eleanor's last attempt to reach across the chasm her son had created. "This is a letter grandmother Eleanor wrote to Mia just 3 months before she died. A letter explaining everything, apologizing for the years of silence, and asking for forgiveness for a separation that was never her choice." He looked directly at Richard, his young face grave with moral judgment. A letter that was never sent because someone decided that his version of family honor was more important than an old woman's final chance to reconnect with her granddaughter. The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of Richard's ragged breathing. 30 years of carefully constructed justifications were crumbling around him, revealing the stark truth of what his control had cost everyone he claimed to love. Mia stared at the evidence spread across the counter, proof that her grandmother had never stopped loving her, never stopped trying to bridge the gap that had defined Mia's entire adult life. The abandonment she'd carried like a scar, the certainty that she wasn't worth fighting for, the deep-seated belief that she was somehow fundamentally unlovable, all of it based on lies maintained by a man who had confused control with protection. 30 years, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of every missed birthday, every unanswered letter, every moment she'd wondered what was wrong with her that made her family willing to forget she existed. 30 years of believing I wasn't worth loving, when the truth was that someone else decided I wasn't worth the trouble of allowing love to exist. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the collapse of everything Richard had built his identity around, and the beginning of Mia's understanding that the inheritance waiting for her was far more complex than property and possessions. The weight of Marcus's revelations hung over the estate like a thundercloud ready to break. Richard had fled to Eleanor's business office immediately after the confrontation, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the hallways like a retreat from battle. Through the closed door, they could hear him making increasingly desperate phone calls to lawyers, to the estate's financial advisor, to anyone who might help him challenge what now seemed legally and morally unassailable. Jennifer moved through the kitchen with mechanical precision, cleaning up the breakfast dishes that no one had touched. Her diplomatic training had finally failed her. There was no middle ground to negotiate when the foundation of everything she'd believed about her family had just collapsed. Her movements were sharp, controlled, each gesture an attempt to maintain some semblance of order in a world that had suddenly become chaos. "I need to pack," she announced to no one in particular, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I need to get the kids and leave. This whole situation is toxic. They don't need to be exposed to this kind of family dysfunction." Mia watched her cousin's careful composure crack, seeing echoes of her own childhood trauma in Jennifer's desperate need to protect her children from the kind of abandonment that had defined Mia's own experience. "Jennifer, you don't have to." "Don't I?" Jennifer whirled around, her diplomat's mask finally slipping to reveal raw pain beneath. "My father has been lying to our entire family for 30 years. He's manipulated every relationship, controlled every connection, decided who deserves love and who doesn't. How am I supposed to explain that to my teenagers? How am I supposed to tell them that their grandfather is a—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "He's a man who confused control with protection," Patty said quietly from her position by the window. "He's not evil, Jennifer. He's just broken in ways that broke everyone around him." "That's supposed to make it better?" Jennifer's voice rose, her careful composure shattering completely. "That's supposed to excuse 30 years of systematic cruelty? Mia was 8 years old when this started. 8. And my father decided she didn't deserve to know her grandmother loved her." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Marcus had withdrawn to the library with his laptop, continuing his archaeological dig through family history. But even from a distance, they could hear his occasional sharp intakes of breath as he uncovered more evidence of Richard's interference. Mia found herself unable to remain in the house. The walls felt like they were closing in, filled with the weight of Eleanor's frustrated love and Richard's suffocating control. She needed air, space, distance from the emotional battlefield the estate had become. The grounds were vast, rolling hills dotted with ancient oak trees that had witnessed generations of family drama. Mia walked without direction, her architect's eye automatically cataloging the careful landscaping, the maintained pathways, the subtle improvements that spoke of Richard's years of stewardship. Even in her anger, she could acknowledge that he had cared for the property with genuine devotion. But caring for things, she realized, was not the same as caring for people. Her wandering brought her to the estate's old cemetery, a small plot surrounded by wrought iron fencing where generations of family members rested under weathered headstones. Eleanor's grave was the newest, the stones still sharp-edged and bright against the older markers worn smooth by Virginia weather. Mia knelt beside her grandmother's headstone, reading the simple inscription, Eleanor Chen, 1932 to 2024, beloved mother and grandmother. The words felt inadequate, failing to capture the woman who had fought so hard to maintain connection across an ocean of family dysfunction. I'm sorry, she whispered to the stone, her professional composure finally cracking completely. I'm sorry I couldn't get here sooner. I'm sorry you died thinking I didn't care. The tears came then. 30 years of grief and abandonment and confusion pouring out in great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the grandmother she'd never really known, for the relationship that had been stolen from both of them, for the little girl who had spent decades believing she wasn't worth fighting for. She never stopped fighting for you. Mia looked up through her tears to find Patty approaching with careful steps, her artist's sensitivity reading the emotional landscape with practiced ease. Even when Richard made it impossible, even when she thought you might hate her for the silence, she never stopped trying to find ways to reach you. Patty settled on the ground beside Mia with the comfortable irreverence that had always marked her as the family rebel. The deed wasn't revenge, you know. It wasn't punishment for Richard or reward for you. It was her final attempt to bring the family back together. By giving me something that would tear everyone apart? Mia's voice was raw from crying. By giving you the power to heal what Richard broke, Patty corrected gently. Eleanor knew that ownership would force confrontation, and confrontation would force truth, and truth would force everyone to choose whether they wanted to perpetuate old wounds or start building something new. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two women separated by a generation, but united by their love for the complex woman buried between them. Her last words to me, Patty said quietly, were about you. She said she hoped you would understand that the estate wasn't really about property. It was about belonging. About having a place where you couldn't be erased or forgotten or cast aside because someone else decided you didn't fit their vision of family. Mia looked back toward the house, where Richard's desperate phone calls continued behind closed doors, and Jennifer packed her children's belongings with the efficiency of someone planning an escape. The family was fracturing exactly as she'd feared it would, the revelation of truth creating more division rather than healing. What if this was a mistake? She asked. What if fighting for this place just destroys what little family connection is left? Patty's smile was sad but knowing. Then you'll know you tried to honor Eleanor's wishes instead of perpetuating Richard's fears. And sometimes, that's the best any of us can do. As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus appeared at the cemetery gate, his laptop tucked under his arm, and his young face grave with purpose. I found something else, he called out. Something that changes everything. Something that might actually give us a way forward instead of just backward. Mia wiped her eyes and stood, brushing cemetery dirt from her knees. Eleanor's final gift might have been more complicated than a simple deed transfer. Her grandmother had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else, and perhaps her last move had been more strategic than anyone realized. The question was whether her fractured family was ready to understand what Eleanor had really been trying to accomplish. Marcus's laptop balanced precariously on an ornate Victorian garden table as the 3 women gathered around him in Eleanor's rose garden. The afternoon sun filtered through the ancient oak branches, casting dappled shadows across his screen, where he'd discovered what he believed might be the key to understanding Eleanor's true intentions. "Look at this," he said, his teenage voice carrying the excitement of someone who just solved a complex puzzle. "I've been going through grandmother Eleanor's correspondence chronologically, and there's a pattern I missed before." Mia wiped the last traces of tears from her cheeks, her emotional breakdown in the cemetery having cleared her head in ways she hadn't expected. The grief was still there, but beneath it lay something steadier, a determination to understand what her grandmother had really wanted rather than simply react to what had been taken from her. "What kind of pattern?" Patty asked, settling into one of the wrought iron chairs with the casual comfort of someone who'd spent years in this garden discussing Eleanor's various schemes and plans. Marcus turned the laptop screen toward them, displaying what appeared to be a legal document dated just 6 months before Eleanor's death. "This is correspondence with her attorney about revising her will. But look, she didn't want to leave the estate to just one person. She was planning to restructure everything to provide for the whole family." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Mia leaned forward, her architect's training making her naturally analytical even in emotional situations. "What do you mean, provide for everyone?" "She wanted to establish a family trust," Marcus explained, scrolling through the document. "The estate would remain intact, but different family members would have specific roles and provisions. Uncle Richard would maintain his position as property manager, Mom would have secure housing for us kids, Aunt Patty would have permanent rights to her studio space, and you," he looked at Mia, "would have legal ownership but with the understanding that the property would serve everyone's needs." Patty's eyes widened with recognition. The conversations she kept having with me about legacy versus inheritance. She kept saying they weren't the same thing. But she died before she could finalize it, Marcus continued, his voice growing more excited as he understood the implications of his discovery. "The lawyer's notes say she was concerned about family resistance to any plan that appeared to reward David's departure. She was trying to find a way to bring you back into the family without creating more division." Mia felt something shift in her chest, not the familiar ache of abandonment, but something closer to understanding. Eleanor hadn't chosen her as inheritor to punish the family that had stayed. She'd chosen her as a catalyst, someone with enough outsider perspective to see beyond the destructive patterns that had trapped everyone else. She knew Richard would challenge anything that looked like charity, Mia said slowly, her architect's mind beginning to see the structure of Eleanor's plan. But she also knew he couldn't challenge clear legal ownership. The deed forces confrontation, but it also creates opportunity for something new. Exactly. Marcus's enthusiasm was infectious, his teenage idealism not yet tempered by adult cynicism about family dynamics. "And look at this. There are notes about specific provisions. Uncle Richard keeping his role but answering to you as owner. Mom having secure housing but also responsibility for family history and traditions. Even provisions for future generations, for kids who might not fit traditional expectations." The last comment carried personal weight that wasn't lost on any of them. Marcus had always been different from the rest of the family, more thoughtful, more questioning, less willing to accept authority simply because it existed. Eleanor had seen in him the same independence of spirit that had driven David away and drawn her to Mia. "Where's Jennifer now?" Mia asked, suddenly understanding that any path forward would require her cousin's involvement. The family couldn't heal through legal ownership alone. It needed the active participation of people willing to choose connection over control. "Upstairs packing," Patty replied. She's convinced that staying here would expose her children to more family toxicity. She's not wrong, but she's also not seeing the bigger picture. Mia stood up, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that had always marked her most important professional moments. "I need to talk to her. Alone." The walk back to the house felt different now, charged with possibility rather than dread. She found Jennifer in one of the upstairs bedrooms, methodically folding clothes into suitcases, with the efficiency of someone who'd had to pack quickly before. The room was clearly being lived in, teenage belongings scattered around, homework assignments stuck to a bulletin board, the accumulated evidence of a family trying to build stability after divorce had upended their world. "Jennifer," Mia said softly from the doorway. Can we talk? Her cousin looked up, her diplomat's mask firmly back in place, despite the redness around her eyes that spoke of private tears. I don't think there's much to discuss. You have the deed. You have the legal right to the property. We'll be out by evening. That's not what I want, Mia said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. And I don't think it's what Eleanor wanted either. Jennifer's hands stilled on a teenager's sweatshirt. What Eleanor wanted is irrelevant now. She's gone, and we're left to deal with the consequences of her choices and my father's lies. Her choices weren't about punishment, Mia said, settling on the edge of the bed where Jennifer had been packing. They were about possibility. About giving us a chance to be better than the generation that came before us. For the first time since Mia's arrival, Jennifer's diplomatic composure cracked enough to show genuine curiosity. What do you mean? I mean that you and I have more in common than either of us realized. We're both single mothers trying to create stability for our children in the wake of relationships that didn't work out. We're both dealing with the legacy of family expectations that don't quite fit who we actually are. We're both trying to honor the past while building something better for the future. Jennifer sat down heavily in the room's antique chair, the fight going out of her posture. My divorce was messy. The kids needed somewhere stable to land, and this place provided that. But knowing it was built on lies, knowing that my father systematically cut you out of the family, how do I explain that to them? How do I model healthy relationships when our entire family foundation is built on deception? By choosing to do better, Mia said simply. By deciding that we don't have to perpetuate the mistakes of the people who came before us. Through the bedroom window, they could see Marcus in the garden below, still hunched over his laptop with Patty reading over his shoulder. 2 generations working together to understand the third, trying to decode Eleanor's final message about what family could become, rather than what it had been. What are you proposing? Jennifer asked quietly. I'm proposing that we try something different, that instead of fighting over what Eleanor left behind, we try to build what she was hoping we could become. Mia reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew the deed that had started this entire confrontation. This piece of paper gives me legal ownership, but it doesn't give me a family. And you can't have true family stability built on someone else's property without their consent. Jennifer looked at the deed, then back at Mia's face, searching for the trap that her diplomatic training told her must be there. You're talking about some kind of arrangement. I'm talking about what Marcus found. Eleanor's real plan. A way for everyone to have what they need while still honoring what she built here. Mia's voice carried the confidence that had made her successful in architecture, the ability to see how separate elements could be combined into something stronger than their individual parts. A family trust, Jennifer said slowly, her quick mind already beginning to see the possibilities. Shared responsibility instead of individual ownership. Shared opportunity, Mia corrected. Your children get stability. Richard gets to maintain his stewardship role, but within healthy boundaries. Patty gets permanent space for her art. You get security and a chance to preserve family history in ways that honor truth instead of comfortable lies. And you get what? For the first time since arriving at the estate, Mia smiled. Not the professional courtesy she'd worn like armor, but something genuine and warm. I get the chance to find out what it means to belong somewhere. To be part of something larger than my individual success. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, her diplomat's mind working through implications and possibilities. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the tentative hope of someone who'd been managing crisis for so long that she'd forgotten what resolution might look like. It would require my father to accept a completely different role, to acknowledge what he's done and commit to being different. Yes, Mia agreed. It would require all of us to choose who we want to be going forward, rather than who we've been forced to be by the past. The bedroom fell silent, except for the sound of Marcus's voice drifting up from the garden, explaining something to Patty with the enthusiasm of youth convinced that problems could be solved through enough research and good intentions. Jennifer looked at her suitcases, then at the bulletin board covered with her children's lives, then finally at Mia, the cousin she'd remembered as a playmate and dismissed as a stranger, who had just offered her something she hadn't expected. The possibility of home without the price of toxic family dynamics. I'll listen, she said finally, but my children's well-being comes first. If this arrangement becomes another version of family dysfunction, we're gone. Agreed, Mia said. Family shouldn't be something people have to endure. It should be something they choose to build together. Through the window, they could see Richard emerging from the office, his phone calls apparently finished, his shoulders carrying the weight of a man who'd just learned that his version of reality was not legally sustainable. The next conversation would determine whether Eleanor's final gamble had succeeded in creating the possibility for healing, or whether it would simply be the final fracture in a family that had been breaking for 30 years. The evening air carried the scent of Eleanor's roses as 4 people gathered on the estate's wraparound porch, each carrying the weight of what they'd discovered about their family's carefully constructed lies. Richard emerged from the business office looking like a man who'd spent hours fighting a battle he was destined to lose, his phone calls to lawyers having confirmed what he already knew but couldn't accept. The deed was legitimate, unassailable, and final. Mia sat in Eleanor's favorite wicker chair, the deed folder resting in her lap like a shield she no longer needed but carried out of habit. Jennifer had positioned herself strategically between her father and the front door, her diplomatic training evident in how she'd chosen a spot that allowed for either mediation or quick retreat. Patty leaned against the porch railing with her artist's casual defiance, while Marcus stood slightly apart, his laptop closed but his young face grave with the responsibility of being the family's unwilling truth-teller. The lawyers confirmed it, Richard said without preamble, his voice hollow with defeat. The deed is legitimate. The will is ironclad. Eleanor left everything to... He couldn't quite bring himself to say Mia's name, as if speaking it would make his loss of control more real. To her granddaughter, Patty finished calmly. The granddaughter you spent 30 years erasing from family history. Richard's face flushed with the dangerous color of a man pushed beyond his limits. I protected this family. I maintained stability. I preserved Eleanor's legacy when everyone else was ready to abandon tradition for the sake of political correctness. You destroyed Eleanor's happiness, Jennifer said quietly, her diplomat's voice carrying steel beneath its measured tone. You intercepted her mail. You lied to her about responses you never allowed her to receive. You played God with people's relationships. I made difficult decisions that no one else was willing to make, Richard shot back. But his authority was cracking like old paint. Someone had to maintain standards. Someone had to protect what Eleanor built from being diluted by outside influences. Mia felt the familiar anger rising but forced herself to remain calm. Her architectural training had taught her that the strongest structures were built on solid foundations, not emotional reactions. What standards, Uncle Richard? The standard that says an 8-year-old child deserves to be punished for her father's choices? The standard that says love is conditional on conformity? You don't understand the pressures we faced, Richard said, his voice rising with desperation. The cultural expectations, the business relationships, the way the community saw us. David's marriage to your mother created complications you can't imagine. I understand perfectly, Mia replied, her voice steady. You were embarrassed. You were afraid that accepting my mother would somehow diminish your standing in a community that probably cared less about your family choices than you imagined. So you chose comfort over connection. Marcus stepped forward, his teenage voice cutting through the adult defensiveness with moral clarity that made everyone uncomfortable. Grandfather, I've read Grandmother Eleanor's letters. All of them. She was ashamed of what this family became under your control. She was embarrassed by the prejudice and the cruelty. The words hit Richard like physical blows. His face cycled through denial, anger, and something approaching panic as he realized that his mother's final judgment of his stewardship was being revealed through the voice of his own grandson. She didn't understand the full picture, he said weakly. She didn't see the broader implications. She saw exactly what you created, Patty interrupted, her artist's bluntness cutting through his justifications. A family built on fear instead of love. A legacy of control instead of connection. A tradition of exclusion instead of embrace. Jennifer stood up, her diplomatic training finally failing her as she faced the man who had shaped her understanding of family loyalty through decades of toxic example. Dad, I've spent my entire adult life trying to be the peacekeeper, trying to smooth over conflicts and maintain harmony. But I can't smooth over 30 years of systematic cruelty. I won't. Jennifer, you don't understand. I understand that my daughter asks me why she doesn't have cousins like her friends do. Jennifer's voice broke slightly. I understand that my son feels like an outsider in his own family because he doesn't fit your narrow definition of what a Chen should be. I understand that I've been enabling your dysfunction by calling it tradition. Richard looked around the porch at the faces of his family. His daughter's disappointment, his grandson's moral judgment, his sister's long-suppressed anger, and his niece's quiet determination. For the first time in 30 years, he was completely alone in his certainty about what was right. You want to give everything away, he said desperately. You want to reward abandonment and punish loyalty. You want to throw away everything I've sacrificed to build. We want to honor what Eleanor actually built, Mia said, opening the folder and withdrawing not just the deed, but Marcus's printouts of Eleanor's correspondence with her attorney. We want to fulfill her real wishes, not the version of her wishes that made you comfortable. She spread the documents across the wicker table, the legal language clear even in the fading evening light. Eleanor was planning to restructure her will to provide for everyone. She wanted the estate to remain intact but serve the whole family's needs. She died before she could finalize it, but her intentions were clear. Richard stared at the papers, his face cycling through confusion and recognition. She never discussed this with me. Because you'd already proven that you couldn't be trusted with decisions that didn't align with your prejudices, Patty said bluntly. She knew you'd fight anything that looked like acceptance of David's choices, or acknowledgement that you'd been wrong. I wasn't wrong, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. David abandoned his responsibilities. He chose his wife over his family. He chose love over fear, Marcus said quietly. And grandmother Eleanor chose love over control when she left everything to Mia. She chose the granddaughter who built a successful life despite being abandoned by her family over the son who built his identity around maintaining that abandonment. The words hung in the evening air like a final judgment. Richard looked at each face around him, his family, but also his accusers, his judges, his last chance for redemption or relationship. What do you want from me? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia leaned forward, her architect's mind already seeing the structure of what could be built on the ruins of what had been destroyed. We want you to choose, Uncle Richard. You can continue fighting for a version of family that's built on exclusion and control, or you can help us build something new, something that honors Eleanor's real legacy instead of your interpretation of it. I want you to apologize, Jennifer said quietly, to Mia, to the memory of Uncle David, to grandmother Eleanor for betraying her trust. I want you to acknowledge what your choices cost everyone, including yourself. And then, Patty added, her voice carrying the weight of decades of witnessing family destruction, I want you to decide whether you're willing to be part of the solution or whether you're going to remain part of the problem. Richard sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 30 years of justified choices crumbling around him. The family he'd worked so hard to protect had been damaged by his protection. The legacy he'd tried to preserve had been distorted by his preservation efforts. The standards he'd maintained had maintained nothing but pain. Around him, 4 people waited for his answer. The answer that would determine whether Eleanor's final gamble had succeeded in creating the possibility for healing, or whether it would simply be the last casualty of a family war that had already claimed too many victims. The evening shadows grew longer as Richard faced the most important choice of his life, whether to continue being the man he'd always been, or to find the courage to become the man his family needed him to be. The silence on the porch stretched until it became unbearable, filled with the weight of Richard's decision, and the collective held breath of a family balanced on the edge of either healing or final fracture. The Virginia evening had settled around them with the soft sounds of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle from neighboring farms, a pastoral backdrop that seemed to mock the intensity of the human drama playing out under Eleanor's carefully tended climbing roses. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the porch boards with a sound like breaking. For a moment, Mia thought he might simply walk away, retreat into the house, and leave them with their ultimatum unanswered. Instead, he moved to the porch railing where Patty had been leaning, his hands gripping the white-painted wood as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. I need to think, he said finally, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man whose entire worldview had collapsed in the span of 2 days. I need time to process what you're asking of me." Without waiting for a response, he walked into the house, his footsteps echoing through the halls until they heard the distant sound of his bedroom door closing. The 4 remaining family members sat in the gathering dusk, each processing the magnitude of what had just happened and what might come next. "He's not going to change," Jennifer said quietly, her diplomat's realism cutting through any false hope. 30 years of behavior doesn't transform overnight because people present him with proof of his mistakes. "Maybe not," Mia agreed. "But Eleanor's plan doesn't actually require his transformation. It just requires his participation. The legal structure we're proposing gives him a role without giving him control." Marcus had been quiet throughout the confrontation with his grandfather, but now he spoke with the moral clarity that had characterized his generation's approach to family dysfunction. "Mom, what kind of model are we setting for Sarah and me if we just accept that people can't change? If we decide that someone's past behavior is more important than their willingness to try something different?" Jennifer looked at her son, this thoughtful teenager who'd somehow maintained his idealism despite growing up surrounded by adult failures, and felt something shift in her chest. Her children had been watching how she handled family conflict, learning from her choices about what relationships should look like and what they should demand from the people who claimed to love them. "You're right," she said slowly, "but protecting you and your sister has to be my priority. If your grandfather can't commit to being different, then our involvement in this family trust idea becomes another form of dysfunction." Patty had been listening to this exchange with her artist's eye for human nature, and now she spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent years observing family patterns. "Richard's not evil, he's just scared. He spent 30 years building his identity around being the family's protector, and now he's being asked to admit that his protection was actually harm. That's not an easy psychological shift." "But it's a necessary one," Mia said firmly, and Eleanor knew it would be necessary when she made her final decision about the estate. She was gambling that the shock of losing control would force him to examine what control had actually cost. As if summoned by their conversation, they heard movement inside the house. Not Richard's heavy footsteps, but lighter sounds that suggested he was moving around, perhaps going through his own version of Marcus's archaeological dig through family history. The evening deepened around them, Virginia's summer air thick with humidity and the scent of night-blooming jasmine that Eleanor had planted years ago. One by one, porch lights came on in neighboring houses, evidence of other families settling into their evening routines with presumably less dramatic conversations about inheritance and betrayal. "I should check on him," Jennifer said finally, her maternal instincts extending even to the father who had disappointed her so profoundly. "Let me," Patty suggested. "He's more likely to be honest with me. We've had 30 years of him trying to manage my artist's rebelliousness, so he's used to me not accepting his authority." She disappeared into the house, leaving Mia, Jennifer, and Marcus alone on the porch with the weight of Eleanor's expectations and their own hopes for what the family might become. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said to Mia, his teenage directness cutting through the adult complexity of the situation. "Are you doing this because you want a family, or because you feel obligated to honor grandmother Eleanor's wishes?" The question was more perceptive than Mia had expected from someone his age, and it forced her to examine her own motivations with uncomfortable honesty. "Both, I think. I've spent my entire adult life building a successful career, but never feeling like I truly belonged anywhere. The estate represents something I've always wondered about, what it would feel like to have roots, to be part of something larger than my individual achievements." "But?" Jennifer prompted, hearing the hesitation in Mia's voice. "But I also know that you can't force belonging. It has to be chosen by everyone involved, not just imposed through legal ownership." Mia looked toward the house where Patty was presumably having a difficult conversation with Richard. "If your father can't genuinely participate in rebuilding family relationships, then the trust idea becomes just another form of control, mine instead of his, but still control." Through the house's tall windows, they could see movement in Eleanor's former study, 2 figures silhouetted against the lamplight, engaged in what looked like an intense conversation. Patty's gestures were animated, while Richard sat hunched in Eleanor's desk chair, occasionally nodding or shaking his head. "What do you think she's telling him?" Marcus asked. "The truth," Jennifer replied. probably truths he's never been willing to hear before. An hour passed before Patty emerged from the house, her expression unreadable in the porch light. She settled back into her chair without speaking, her artist's hands folded carefully in her lap. "Well?" Jennifer prompted. "He's been reading Eleanor's letters to him," Patty said quietly. "The ones she wrote but never sent because she knew he wouldn't listen. Letters about her disappointment, her regret, her growing understanding that his version of family protection was actually family destruction." "How is he handling it?" Mia asked. "Like a man whose entire life story is being rewritten," Patty replied. "He's angry, he's defensive, he's hurt, and underneath all of that, I think he's terrified that it might be too late to become the person Eleanor needed him to be." Marcus leaned forward with the intensity of someone whose generation believed in the possibility of redemption. "But it's not too late, is it? If he's willing to acknowledge what he's done and commit to being different?" "That depends," Patty said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of family observation, "on whether he's willing to let go of being right in order to start being loving." As if responding to their conversation, the study light went out, and they heard Richard's footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who'd spent the evening confronting the cost of 30 years of choices he'd believed were necessary. Tomorrow would bring his answer, and with it, the final determination of whether Eleanor's legacy would be the estate she'd built or the family she'd hoped they could become. In the Virginia darkness, 4 people sat with the knowledge that inheritance was more complicated than property, and that the most valuable things couldn't be transferred through legal documents. They had to be chosen, built, and maintained through the daily decision to love people as they were, rather than as you wished they could be. The question now was whether Richard could make that choice, and whether they could build something new on the foundation of everything that had been broken. The morning sun cast long shadows across Eleanor's dining room as the family gathered around the mahogany table one final time, the weight of 2 days' revelations settling over them like dust from an old house finally opened to fresh air. Richard sat at the head of the table, not because anyone had granted him that authority, but because it was the chair closest to the door, positioned for either leadership or escape. His appearance told the story of a sleepless night. His usually immaculate shirt was wrinkled, his silver hair uncombed, his eyes carrying the hollow look of someone who'd spent hours staring into the mirror of his own choices. In his hands, he held a manila folder, not the deed that had started this confrontation, but something else entirely. Mia sat to his right, no longer the uncertain woman who'd arrived with a single suitcase 2 days ago.